With that setup, I'm Candy Wolff, and I run global government affairs for Citigroup. So I do come at the discussion from a policy perspective. I am not charged with the 400 regulations that Dodd-Frank requires for implementation, and I'm very glad that I do not have that responsibility. There are many in New York and others around the globe that have the day-to-day grind. But I'm based in Washington, D.C., so I thought perhaps the best perspective I could bring is both to some of the trends that we see politically and then how we're dealing and interacting on the TTIP, because I think a lot of what Peter said is where Citi is coming from. And as a large global too-big-to-fail bank, we are facing many of the global coordination issues front and center and trying to figure out how to manage the path forward. But I think before we get into kind of the U.S. perspective around TTIP and then the business community perspective around it, I want to speak just a minute to some of the broader political climate as we see it, and certainly as I see it. If you look at the developed countries over the last few years, you're starting to see a return to nationalism or localism, depending on how you want to define it, and a retreat from globalism. And it's leading to the fragmentation that we see, and it's not just speaking to financial services, it's more broadly than certainly financial services. But it used to be the case that economic growth would help to solve for the issues of globalization and some of the concerns that come with globalization. And what we're finding, at least, I don't know, if it's too soon to tell, but if you look at two growing economies, both the United States and the UK, you still see the fragmentation, the nationalism, and the localism. And I can turn to the Tea Party right in the US, which is moving away from trade and becoming much more protectionist, which is also going to make it quite difficult to get agreements through the US Congress. And then similarly, you can look to the progressive left on the Democratic side in the US, that also has been fairly anti-trade historically and continues that way. And you start to see the ability of a right-left coalition coming together that puts the U.S. in a much more difficult position when the administration is trying to negotiate to understand what can and can't get through the U.S. Congress, whereas previously it was sort of trade. Well, we know we have some issues around ag and a few other places, but for the most part we could get something through. This is before we even get to the question of financial services and where it plays in that discussion. In the UK, I just turned to UKIP and the discussions and the fragmentation, and I only have to look to many of you to know the post-parliament elections and the increase in the fringe parties and the relevance. So, I think I'm not speaking just for myself. We have a political scientist who's on staff and has been making a number of speeches and put out papers to this point that there seems to be a shift. And what will happen, we've always sort of assumed that growth in economies will mean that some of these issues can dissipate, and we haven't yet seen that occur. And I think it's going to create a set of political challenges as we look at solutions to continued fragmentation and just turning it over to kind of financial services. How do you start taking that very fragmented approach and try to come up with coordination when there's still a drive and a need for localization? And maybe one more point, we had a discussion last night around dinner, and we were talking about this question of globalization and what was driving it. And the discussion was leading to this notion that it's fear and the lack of control, that it could be pointed to as one of the reasons for continued focus around nationalism and localism. And so, how you sort of address that from a geopolitical perspective, because we know that regulators are not operating in isolation. We know that political bodies are not operating in isolation, even if we all like to believe that they're not really politically motivated. I certainly can put a hat on and know that you have to at least understand what the body politic is thinking. And if there's a shift in that process, I think it's going to be politically in different countries. I think it makes it a challenge to understand how we as a business at Citi are going to try to figure out how to navigate 100 countries in which we do business and other similar financial institutions who will face many of the same questions. How do you start to navigate in this fragmented regulatory environment? So with that, I will I think speak to one of the efforts that we've certainly undertaken to try to address some of the fragmentation. We do have the continued discussions with the regulators across the Atlantic, or over here, I should say, But, it's a continued challenge as we look around the globe to understand what structures and processes can be put in place that provide some continuity going forward. And we're not seeing the FSB as the solution yet. And maybe over time it can be, but I think as part of the B20, which is the business community's input into the G20 discussions, there's been papers and documentation written indicating that we would support an effort to have more action in 2015. I think we've heard a lot of talk, but we haven't really seen the regulatory process and the cooperation come together in a structure that is beyond the dialogue approach and into a process. And I want to reiterate something that Peter said, that it's, to be clear, there's a lot of criticism that comes with trying to put a structure in place that's process-oriented, and it's viewed as undermining. Either undermining Dodd-Frank, undoing the law, or here in Europe, it's the same thing. You're just undermining the existing rules. And I think we all want to be clear that what we're talking about is, in fact, a process, not an outcome. We're not trying to say that this should be the result. And in fact, when I put my U.S. hat on and look at Dodd-Frank rules, most of these things are going to be done before we even get to a process to have regulatory cooperation. We're going to be in the continued dialogue back and forth for a while here, and as Dodd-Frank is finishing, it's what happens next, and how do we take the layers upon layers of rules that are being imposed and then create some structure that allows for that more coordinated dialogue. And that's where I think many of us had the same reaction to a treaty process and a TTIP process that might be able to attempt to formulate something, because there's not a lot of options. You can have this discussion around FSB, but who's pulling it together, and who's going to create the process around it, and who's sort of mandated to say, okay, yeah, you do have to talk to each other, and here's how you have to do it, and here's how the process should occur. And it seems to be easier when you're in a treaty discussion to be able to begin that dialogue and see what it will foster and what it will bring. I would say from the U.S. perspective, Peter was speaking to the EU. I think one of the challenges as we look at financial services, and if I have any Treasury colleagues in here, we talk directly to Treasury as well and express our concerns. But there's really been a lack of willingness on the part of the U.S. to bring the financial coordination piece to the table for discussions in TTIP. And a lot of that is around this question around politics of, well, then the banks are just trying to undo the regulation and therefore it remains a threat. And so I also think it's territorial. And, we've got a lot of regulatory bodies that have some interest in the various regulations, and as with anything, people like their territory, they like their space, and they want to keep it, and they really don't want to be viewed as having to do something perhaps differently or potentially achieve an outcome. So I think there's a little bit of that pushback. But from a business perspective, certainly city's perspective, we've been pretty adamant that we think that this is an important path forward. And we're trying to provide guidance and support and continue to push to see if we can bring a financial regulatory discussion forward with support from the U.S. government. In order to do that, there's a few treaty things that have to get done, like passing laws that allow for negotiations that can get through the U.S. Congress, which remain to be considered in the course of the next year, of which we will attempt to advocate. For those of you who are at all trade junkies, it's another T. So we have TTIP and we have TPP and we have TISA, but in the U.S. we have Trade Promotion Authority, TPA. And that is the authority by which the U.S. government is allowed to take an agreement and pass it without amendment, which is an important part to the discussion, because why would you have a negotiation close and then have it reopened as a consequence of a legislation changing the structure? But I think that has been a hindrance in the ability to continue some of the discussions and close other agreements going forward. And I would say, from just a final point on the U.S. side, TTIP is the example that I think we all would like to see. The guidance and the structure that eventually has to get into the conversation to the G20, a conversation that involves many Asian countries that are beginning to pick up a lot of the regulatory issues, will look to the US and the EU and the process that is stated here and the standards that are set here to see if it can be taken into a more global context. So while we look at our issues globally, at the end of the day, the discussion between the US and the EU is the critical discussion. Because if we can solve it here it can be the blueprint going forward. If we fail to solve it here, then I think it raises the specter that it's going to be difficult to solve at a G20 level. So with that, I thank you.